May 1945. The final gunshots had fallen silent across the European battlefield. The thousand-year empire that Adolf Hitler once promised would rule the world had collapsed into ruins after only 12 years of existence. While millions of Europeans poured into the streets to celebrate Victory Day, in the dark corners of the continent, a silent and unprecedented mass escape was quietly unfolding. Thousands of SS officers, senior officials of the Nazi Party, and those who held the regime's darkest secrets were shedding their polished uniforms and slipping into the tattered clothing of refugees. These were the men who had operated the machinery of genocide, the so-called architects of death, now seeking ways to vanish into nothingness. Have you ever wondered how the most infamous figures, the men hunted by the entire world, were able to calmly pass through Allied checkpoints? Who provided them with forged passports, financial support, and secret routes that led them all the way to distant South America? To understand this escape, we must return to the concept of Stunde Null, or 0 hour. This was the moment when Germany had no government, no laws, and a completely paralyzed administrative system. Amid the chaos of more than 10 million refugees moving across Europe, an SS colonel claiming to be a homeless farmer became easier than ever to believe. The Ratlines, and how Nazi officials slipped through the net of justice. When Allied forces entered Berlin, they faced a question without precedent in modern history. How do you punish crimes that fall outside every existing legal framework? Before 1945, the world had no complete legal definition for the concept of crimes against humanity. The Nuremberg trials were therefore not merely a prosecution, they were a moral experiment, an attempt to construct a new normative order from the ruins of war. But that very moment, when the law was being rewritten, inadvertently triggered a race against time between the hunters and the hunted. With each passing day, justice advanced one step, and with each step, new gaps for escape quietly emerged. At the height of their power, Nazi leaders such as Heinrich Himmler and Hermann Göring viewed themselves as beings above the law, so-called demigods, deciding the fate of millions. But when the empire collapsed, the illusion of supremacy shattered, revealing a fragmented psychological landscape. One group chose the most extreme path: suicide. Adolf Hitler, Joseph Goebbels, and later Himmler ended their lives to evade judgment. For them, when the ideology died, the self no longer had a reason to exist, but a larger group reacted in the opposite way: survive at any cost. The slogans of Aryan supremacy were discarded in an instant. Men who once signed execution orders now trembled behind aliases, ready to betray comrades, even to exploit the newly forming justice system itself in order to disappear. First, the scale of the crimes exceeded the capacity for immediate prosecution. The Allies possessed lists of tens of thousands of suspects, but lacked centralized databases and unified identification standards across occupation zones. Second, Germany in 1945 was a wasteland of paperwork. City halls were destroyed by bombing. Many intelligence offices destroyed their own files before retreating. In that chaos, a forged identity document, sometimes nothing more than a local certificate, could transform a perpetrator into a so-called war victim. At the same time, Europe entered an unprecedented displacement crisis. Millions wandered without nationality, without records, without a place to return to. This humanitarian emergency created a gray identity market: temporary papers, humanitarian certificates, refugee cards, tools essential for saving innocent lives, yet also exploitable by those with money, connections, and time. Within these administrative ruptures, clandestine support networks began to form. Not a single master plan, but fragmented logistics document brokers, transit points, maritime routes. Ports such as Genoa are cited in memoirs and post-war investigations as possible departure points, varying in organization and scale by case, and not every ship leaving port carried fleeing criminals. While judges at Nuremberg debated new moral standards, the world order was already shifting. The Cold War was emerging. Scientific knowledge, intelligence networks, and the so-called utility value of individuals began to be weighed. A painful ethical question arose: prioritize absolute justice or future security? There were no simple answers, only decisions made in gray zones, where every choice produced aftershocks lasting decades. As justice was being redefined, history did not stand still. And it was precisely in the gap between ideals and reality that the silent escape began not as a cinematic myth, but as a cold equation of documents, routes, and the tides of the time. After 1945, the Ratlines did not exist as a single secret route drawn neatly on a map. They functioned more like a human supply chain, crude, yet perfectly aligned with post-war reality. An escape rarely resembled a spy film. It began by severing the past, abandoning old papers, ranks, and insignia. Next came a new name, usually common enough to attract no attention. Then came legalization, not through violence, but through the language of humanitarianism. Temporary documents for stateless persons. And finally, lawful movement, boarding a ship as one migrant among thousands of others. Each step, taken alone, appeared legitimate, but when combined, they formed an escape route that justice could not close in time. What made the Ratlines possible was not elaborate conspiracy, but the largest refugee crisis in modern European history. More than 10 million people drifted across borders that had effectively vanished, homeless, stateless, and undocumented. In displacement camps and on paper, everyone looked the same, individuals whose pasts had been erased by war. In that sea of humanity, the guilty did not need to hide well. They only needed not to stand out. This was the central moral paradox of the Ratlines. A system designed to save the innocent unintentionally became the perfect shelter for the guilty. Rome played a pivotal role in this reality. Not only a religious center, the city was also a place where documents could be produced faster than almost anywhere else in post-war Europe. Relief organizations, embassies, religious institutions, and administrative offices coexisted within an overloaded and exhausted space. With a single personal endorsement, a baptismal record, a humanitarian certificate, a new individual could come into existence on paper. There is no evidence of a centralized identity printing factory for Nazi criminals. But there were countless individual decisions made amid anti-communist sentiment, administrative overload, and the belief that the war was over, that the world needed closure rather than deeper excavation. The myth of Odessa was born from this very unease. In hindsight, it is difficult to accept that so many perpetrators escaped simply through chaos and fragmented decisions. A single, all-powerful, secret organization feels easier to comprehend. But modern research shows no evidence confirming a centralized machine like those depicted in films. Instead, there were loose networks, former comrades helping one another, those with money buying time, buying silence, buying a place on a ship. The Ratlines were not one road, but dozens of overlapping paths, existing because no one ever saw the whole picture. Upon leaving Europe, many headed toward South America, particularly Argentina. For Europe, the war was an unhealed scar. For South America, it was a distant story. Under Juan Perón, Argentina viewed arriving Germans not only through a political lens, but through utility engineers, disciplined military men, technical specialists. One did not need to be a Nazi ideologue. One only needed to be useful. For some escapees, this was not merely a refuge, but an opportunity for rebirth, a blank page where memories of war faded with geographic distance. All of this raises a moral question, with no complete answer. Tightened documentation, and millions of innocent people remain trapped in the ruins. Loosen it, and the guilty slip through. The Ratlines are not only a story of Nazis on the run, they are the fracture point where law, humanitarianism, and politics could not perfectly align in a world just emerging from collapse. And as these rat routes operated in the shadows, another force began to take notice, not to hunt, but to assess value. The world was entering the Cold War. Some fugitives were no longer pursued. They began to be bargained over. There is a common misunderstanding when speaking about post-war escapes, the belief that once a network exists, a perpetrator simply disappears forever. Reality was far more complex. After 1945, justice did not operate like an instant punch, but like a massive wheel turning slowly, rolling over layers of procedure, colliding with geopolitics, sometimes slipping off the trail, but at times still crushing those who ran. To see this mechanism clearly, we turn to three representative case files. Three individuals, three types of escape, captured early, captured late after a special operation, and escaped until death. Each story is a fragment of a larger question: why some never managed to flee, some ran for 10 years, and some nearly an entire lifetime. Rudolf Höss was the commandant of Auschwitz, a symbol of transforming killing into a process. When the war ended, Höss disappeared. No bodyguards, no secret base, just one very post-war reality, a different name and a different life. While in hiding, Höss used a false identity and attempted to dissolve into normalcy, manual labor, a quiet life, avoiding all attention. The chilling contrast lies here. The same hands that once signed orders, coordinated, and legalized mass death could now calmly tend a garden, pull weeds, as if the past were merely a set of clothes that had been taken off. But post-war justice often did not begin with the crime itself. It began with connections. British investigators focused on family, especially Höss's wife, because in a world without centralized data, family functioned as a living fingerprint. Interrogation pressure and fear for the future of their children caused cracks to form. From there, the hiding place was exposed. The decisive moment came from a small but costly detail, a wedding ring. When arrested, Höss tried to cling to the role of an ordinary man. But when ordered to remove the ring, he claimed it was stuck and could not be taken off. Investigators threatened to cut off his finger. Höss was forced to remove it. Inside the ring were engraved the names Rudolf and Hedwig. An everyday piece of evidence, not a secret document, collapsed the disguise. Höss's end carried powerful symbolism. He was taken back to Auschwitz, tried and executed by hanging at the very site he had once commanded. While ritual details and the precise setting may vary across sources, the notion of the wheel turning back to the crime scene is a historical truth, often emphasized to show that justice can be more than a sentence. It can be a forced return. If Höss represents the executor within a specific space, Adolf Eichmann represents bureaucratic, evil organizing, coordinating, transporting, scheduling, in other words, turning genocide into a logistics problem. After the war, Eichmann fled to Argentina under a false name and lived for many years as a middle-class worker. What makes this period unsettling is the banality of the surface: going to work, coming home, raising children, a life normal enough that neighbors asked no questions. And this was the strongest camouflage of all normality. But Eichmann's past did not remain dormant. Leads from the Jewish community in Argentina and from survivors helped revive the trail. Mossad became involved, verified his identity, and carried out the capture operation in 1960 in Buenos Aires, bringing Eichmann to Israel for trial. The specific mechanics of the operation are recounted differently across accounts, but the central axis identification, seizure, transfer to Israel, and trial is historical consensus. The Eichmann trial in Jerusalem was not merely a legal case. It was a legal stage that forced the world to confront the Holocaust through testimony and evidence, shaping how global society would speak about genocide for decades to come. At the center of the trial, Eichmann repeatedly clung to one argument: I was only following orders. And it was in observing a man who appeared very ordinary, not screaming, not insane, that the thinker Hannah Arendt introduced her famous concept of the banality of evil, not to diminish guilt, but to warn that extreme evil can be carried out by people who have abandoned moral judgment, leaving only obedience and target completion. This is the point where the documentary must tighten its pacing. Audiences often expect a monster, but history sometimes delivers something more terrifying: a criminal who looks like a civil servant. And it is precisely this sense of nothing special that makes society shudder. Among the three, Josef Mengele haunts in a different way, not because of command, authority, or administrative role, but because he was a doctor, a title associated with saving lives, yet he carried out inhuman experiments at Auschwitz. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum describes Mengele as one of the most notorious SS doctors at Auschwitz, associated with brutal experiments and the selection of prisoners on the railway platform. Mengele escaped Europe and drifted through South America. What allowed him to evade capture for so long was not luck alone. Research on post-war escape often emphasizes two factors: finances and support networks. Money bought shelter, transportation, documents, and most importantly, time. Time to disappear before the net closed. Mengele died in 1979 after suffering a stroke while swimming near the coast of Brazil, and he was buried under a false name. Years later, his remains were exhumed in 1985. An identification was established through forensic analysis, later reinforced by DNA testing in the early 1990s, an emblematic case of evidentiary justice arriving late, after the suspect was no longer alive to face trial. The chilling point here is not only that he escaped. It is the sense of a tilted moral scale. One man hanged at the crime scene, one tried publicly before global cameras, and one who died naturally. No verdict, no sentence, no confrontation with victims. These three cases reveal a disturbing but real pattern. Outcomes did not depend solely on the magnitude of crimes. They depended on whether connections were exposed, whether the individual could be normalized into invisibility within the crowd, whether resources existed to keep moving, and whether the world at that moment still prioritized pursuit or had already shifted its focus. There is a bitter truth that history is forced to acknowledge. Not all fleeing Nazi officials and specialists disappeared to the south. Some of them followed different paths, invited rather than hunted toward the west and the east. Almost the moment World War II ended, a new confrontation formed nearly instantly. The Cold War began not with cannons, but with maps, dossiers, and personnel lists. Between the United States and the Soviet Union, a race to seize German intellectual capital erupted not out of mercy, but out of fear of falling behind. In the West, the United States launched Operation Paperclip. More than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians were brought to America. Officially, they were technical experts deemed essential to national security. In reality, some among them had been active members of the Nazi Party, even directly connected to the machinery of war and forced labor. In the East, the Soviet Union responded with Operation Osoaviakim, forcibly relocating thousands of engineers and their families to Soviet territory in a single night. Two opposing systems, two different methods, but one shared objective: seize the knowledge before the other side did. The most emblematic figure of this compromise was Wernher von Braun. He was the chief architect of the V-2 rocket, the weapon that rained destruction on London and many European cities. After the war, von Braun became a central figure in the American missile program, and later in NASA, contributing to humanity's journey to the moon. To achieve that technological leap, the pasts of him and many others were blurred. Files were edited. Sensitive connections were set aside. not because they did not exist, but because they no longer aligned with the new priorities. By the late 1940s, Allied enthusiasm for hunting Nazi war criminals began to cool. The reason was not forgiveness, but geopolitics. Germany, once the enemy, had become a strategic front line against the Soviet Union. A stable Germany, with a smoothly functioning administrative system, mattered more than excavating the pasts of tens of thousands of individuals, a process that could spark social chaos and paralyze reconstruction efforts. Within this context, British and American war crimes units were gradually dissolved or scaled back. Investigators who had once tracked the SS were reassigned to new missions, hunting communist spies. The enemy had changed, and with it, the definition of moral priority also shifted. This was not a secret conspiracy signed behind closed doors. It was a sequence of pragmatic decisions, made step by people who believed they were preventing a greater catastrophe. But what was the cost of that pragmatism? Thousands who had contributed to the machinery of crime were allowed to live in peace within post-war German society itself, or in Western countries, under the labels of experts, advisors, and scientists. The Cold War did not only divide the world into two blocks, it divided conscience itself. Justice, in many cases, was forced to yield to fear and strategic calculation, not because the crimes were forgotten, but because people chose to believe that more dangerous threats lay ahead. And it is here that history leaves behind a question with no complete answer. Can a victory still be whole? If it is built upon deliberate forgetting, looking back on this entire journey, what emerges is not a chain of extraordinary conspiracies, nor some kind of mystical power. Most of the Nazi officials who escaped did so because they understood the moment in history. They exploited post-war chaos, the gaps within humanitarian systems, and most importantly, the shift in priorities of the great powers. As the world turned toward new fears, old crimes were pushed to the back pages of the files. But history also reveals another truth. The struggle for justice never fully goes out. In the shadows of compromise and silence, there were still individuals who chose to swim against the current. Simon Wiesenthal, a survivor of the concentration camps, devoted his entire life to tracking down fugitives. He did not act out of hatred, but out of a cold and persistent belief. Justice for the past is the only warning for the future. For Wiesenthal, each pursuit was not merely a case file, but a reminder that crime does not simply disappear with time. It is true that many, like Josef Mengele, never stood before a court of law. But that escape did not equal freedom. They lived for decades in constant fear, changing names, changing locations, avoiding attention, flinching at every knock on the door. History has marked them not as victors, but as cowards, forever imprisoned within their own shadows. The final lesson does not lie in who escaped, but in the responsibility of the systems that allowed it to happen. When justice is delayed in the name of a greater good, the cost is not only missed verdicts, it is the erosion of moral standards. History reminds us that humanitarianism cannot exist without accountability, and security cannot replace justice. In closing, this story does not belong to a distant past. It is a warning for the present. Whenever the world faces crisis, choices made in gray zones will return. And the old question remains, not for historians alone, but for all of us. When forced to choose, will we be steadfast enough to place justice alongside safety? History is not only pages recording the past, it is a mirror reflecting the responsibility of each individual. The story of fleeing Nazi officials reminds us that when a person abandons conscience to become a tool of a brutal system, the price paid is not only legal punishment, but the decay of their own soul. Thank you for joining us as we explored this complex chapter of history. If you found this video useful, please press like and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss future in-depth historical analyses. We look forward to seeing you again on our upcoming journeys into the past.